evening. It's about that time, and we are ready for Acts chapter 27. And we are drawing to the close of this, of the record of... Whoop, it works. So, a little bit of a delay, but they don't know that until now. I'm telling them. All right. We're drawing to the close of the record that the book of Acts leaves us, and that's going to open up a new period of letter writing, and we'll talk about that as days come. But over the last several chapters, we have been focusing on the Apostle Paul as he has faced trials in front of, well, really kind of a mob trial in front of the Jewish people there in the temple, and then in front of the Sanhedrin, which progresses to a trial in front of Felix, and then in front of Festus, and then in front of Agrippa. And as we followed Paul along, we find a couple of common themes throughout all of that. I think one key theme is that what Paul says is that he was at one point where they were, but especially with reference to the Jewish teachers and leaders. And then he says, but something changed. Something happened that made me go in a completely different direction and start following Jesus. And he points to the occasion where he became a witness, where he saw Jesus on the road to Damascus and then was obedient to the gospel when he went into the city. And so that provides him, I think, a couple of things. First of all, I think it provides an avenue to try to reach some soft heart that's out there. And just to say, listen, I know how you're feeling here. And let me tell you why I have made this change, and he's able to do his work as a witness. But I think also it maybe as he stood before the Romans would serve as a way to give a defense of himself and to say, look, this is not something that is some out of nowhere wild branch of Judaism, but rather it's in fulfillment of the promises that God has made. And so as he makes his way through, the constant refrain is when they get done judging Paul, they say he hadn't done anything worthy of death. And I think we'll see that reiterated even in chapters 27 and 28.
So what's the theme verse of the book of Acts we talked about? Yeah, and what does it say? Who said that? Okay. Starting in Jerusalem, then Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world. So that's where we started off. We start off in Jerusalem. And where is kind of the center of the known, knowledgeable world at this time? Rome. That's what I'm looking for. And where's Paul headed? Rome. And so what I think you have in the book of Acts is you have the gospel. What Luke is showing us is the gospel is spreading from Jerusalem to the uttermost parts of the world. And if we get the gospel to Rome, which by the way the gospel has already been to Rome, Paul has already written a letter to the Romans. But if we see the gospel going to Rome, then I think that kind of completes the idea that it goes everywhere. And so Paul knows that he's going to Rome. He prayed to go to Rome. And God now has told him that he will go to Rome. And so he's expecting that. It's going to be a long, bumpy road. And so we start off in chapter 27, when it was decided that we should sail to Italy. So they're heading out. All right, so where's Paul at right now? At this point? Caesarea Maritima. And I showed you an aerial photo of it the other day. Here's an artist's rendition of what it would have looked like in the days when Paul would have been there. You remember the amphitheater there, the hippodrome, Herod's palace, and the place where Paul most likely would have been held and certainly would have stood trial for these things. And so Paul has been there how long now? 2 years. But it's time now to go. And so they decided to sail. And so Paul and some of the other prisoners were handed over to one Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. And so it's interesting that some of the centurions are named here. And I think, first of all, it's interesting because Paul had enough of a connection with these by simply having to deal with them so frequently. He wasn't always chained. I doubt he would have been chained to the centurion, but he would have been chained to soldiers that answered to the centurion, and he would have had contact with the centurion. And Luke here knows this centurion, mentions him by name, because Luke is going to go along with him as well. So Paul is just another prisoner, sort of, and is put on this ship. And so you think about, today if we want to transport prisoners, do we take public transportation? No. But in ancient times, what would happen is the prisoners would be committed to a soldier, an officer, who would guard them with his life, and then he would use whatever means he could to get them wherever they needed to go. And back then, you didn't necessarily have public transportation in the way of people, what's the word I'm looking for here, a vehicle that is only for passengers. You had a vehicle that was carrying cargo, and if there was room, passengers could jump on as well. And usually passengers either had to pay a fee, or they could say, well, look, I'll just help out during the trip. And so sometimes even prisoners would be used for that purpose on these trips. So anyway, I want to get this picture kind of in mind that Paul is about to get on this ship, and he's going to be on this ship for a while, and it's not going to be the most pleasant of circumstances. And that's helpful to me, because is there any doubt at this point that God, by his providence, is seeing Paul to Rome? No, it's clear to us as we look at this. God is working this out. Is it comfortable and easy for Paul? No, it's not. So I've mentioned this several times, but that is helpful to me to realize that God can be working in my life, and it's not just as smooth as I think it should be when God is doing that. All right, so I want to make a few points here, and then I'll let you go, but I'll mention something here. Anytime that I get an opportunity, I like to try to show you the places where these things happened, because I think that's helpful for us in recognizing, oh yeah, this wasn't once upon a time in a faraway land. These are real places. So if Paul would have been held over here, which is where most people think that he was held, in order to get to the port, to go out to sea, he would have had to walk down this causeway right here, come around, go in front of this temple that would have been built there, and come to this. You can go there today and you can still see the walkway. This would be right here, right, that building right there is the foundation, or that stonework is the foundation of the temple that used to be there. Paul would have walked down this. This is where all of the ships would have docked. What you have now is all of that's filled in with silt, and is no longer water, it's land there now. But this would have been the loading walk there for the ships. And what you would see is, if you turned around and looked out this way, is you would be looking out across this port. If you look, you can still see part of the wall, the seawall that was built there to enclose this port. That's what's left of it. And the foundation of that dates all the way back to Herod the Great when he built this. So anyway, that's where Paul was. We know within a few square feet of where Paul would have walked to be able to board this ship to make this trip. And so I think that that's interesting when you see that. And so he, other prisoners, other passengers, and brethren that are going to accompany him. I just want you to think about signing up for, Paul's got to go. He's chained to a soldier who's taking him to Caesar. Did Luke have to go? I don't know that Luke had to go. And Luke said, I'll go with you. And others said, I'll go with you. And boy, they were volunteering for some really challenging times ahead. But they wanted to be a support to their brother. They wanted to further the gospel in whatever way that they could. So, verse 2. So, entering a ship of the Adramyttian, we put out to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And so there we know that Luke was there, and also Aristarchus.
Yeah, so as we look at the trajectory that they're taking, we might think that they would just be making a straight shot for Rome. And this goes along with what Lonnie was saying about they would just board whatever ship was available. There were very few, I guess you would say, direct ships to Rome from Palestine. Most of these ships, as he made mention, are carrying some kind of cargo. So they want to go places where they can sell this cargo, offload it, And so notice that in verse 2 it says to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. So you're really just looking for a ship that's kind of headed in your direction. You're not really looking for a ship that's necessarily going to Rome, and you're just going to kind of try to, it's almost like hitchhiking your way from point to point along the way. And so sometimes you might look at this and you say, well, that's not going in the direction of Rome at all. And really it's just kind of getting us a little bit closer as we go. And so it creates some inconvenience as far as getting there, but it's a lot cheaper way to travel. If you're just kind of tagging along somewhere, it's a far less expensive thing than getting your own ship. And I don't think many ships at all just sailed straight across the Mediterranean Sea, even those that were maybe like commissioned by the emperor or something. They don't just sail straight across because it's too dangerous to be out there on the open water like that. And so they kind of stick close to the shoreline very often anyway. And that's what made the Mediterranean Sea such a center of commerce, is because there were islands and port cities all the way around it, so that you could do a lot of commerce and trade without having to go a long time in the open water. And so you have in verse 3, the next day we put in at Sidon, which obviously is in the northern part there, what once was Phoenicia. You see Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And I assume those friends are Aristarchus and Luke and maybe some others at the ports that they're visiting. But that word, treated him kindly, is the word from which we get the word philanthropist. He does good to him. He's allowing him some special privileges and kindnesses that I don't think most prisoners in general would have gotten. And so perhaps that's part of his citizenship privileges that he's getting taken care of. They're not going to treat him brutally like they might treat somebody else.
And you remember when Paul came from his third missionary journey and was going back to Jerusalem, that he stopped at Tyre, and there were brethren there. And now we see, it says friends, but I assume those are brethren in Sidon as well. So there seems to be brethren all along this area. And Paul's going to find brethren in other places as well. And so it says, when we put out to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the wind was contrary to us. Sailing under the shelter of Cyprus, they sailed on the north side of Cyprus, because the wind was contrary. So rather than being able to maybe go this direction or maybe some other route, that seems to be the course that they had to take.
So the island like blocks the wind so that it's not blowing. If you're out on the open sea, the wind is blowing directly at you. But if you can almost use Cyprus as kind of a buffer there to keep that. And obviously these ships are depending on wind in order to be able to move in any direction. So, yeah.
So when they had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And I got ahead of myself there, but they came to Myra right here. So you remember Perga and Pamphylia, Cilicia, this area. You remember Paul on his first missionary journey. So can you imagine him sailing along the coast there and looking over at the seashore and saying, well, that's the brethren over there in Galatia. Remember in the first missionary journey when I went over there, I wonder how those brethren are doing. He would be able to see those things as he's traveling. I wonder if I'll ever see those brethren again, and on this side of eternity. And so, it's interesting just to think about that journey as it took place there.
Yep. So, and then the centurion does what they were required to do. He finds another ship that is going to go further. And now here is one that's coming from Alexandria in Egypt, and they're going to go all the way to Italy, at least ideally. That's what's going to happen. And so they're able to board this ship. And notice verse 7, we sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, or Cnidus, but maybe Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Lee, and yours said shelter, I think that's the same word. And coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea.
Yeah, so we're right here on the south side of the island of Crete there. Any comments or questions through verse 8?
How close can we nail down a time frame here as far as what year we're talking about? Or maybe when he gets to Rome, what?
I think we can be pretty certain that this is going to be the fall of 60 AD. I think that this date, is that what you understand as well?
I didn't know it was that. I didn't know it could be that precise.
I think we can be pretty precise that this is 60, and it's going to be in the fall because they're trying to beat winter and they're not going to do it.
Yep.
And so I think this is one of the times that we can be fairly certain on.
Now, and there is a reference to the fast, which is Yom Kippur, and I don't know what verse that's in now that I'm thinking about it.
You're looking at verse, well, I thought it was verse 9, or
Yeah.
where does it say where the fast, because the fast had already...
Oh, yes, this is verse 9. So this is verse 9. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them. So that fast is the Day of Atonement, or what now Jews call Yom Kippur, and that's going to be late September, early October. So,
That's the time of year we are.
yeah, right now.
Right now.
Yeah.
Except 60 AD.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So
All right. Any other thoughts?
it was probably September 22nd.
Probably.
If it wasn't, it should have been.
Paul be allowed that special privilege. I showed you what kind of prisoner he was, but I'm sure it had something to do with citizenship.
Yeah. Yeah.
right.
He would have had some level of trust.
I think that's exactly right. And it's really interesting to see how that trust builds as this goes on, to the point that it's really just incredible faith that's exercised by the centurion later on.
Yeah.
You know, here you see confidence in Paul, some trust in him. Then you're going to see where, well, should I trust him? It makes no sense to trust him, and so I won't at this point. And then later, it's like, it still makes no sense to trust him, but I absolutely will. And I think it's interesting to see that.
So he was in there in Caesarea when he's being tried.
Yeah.
And given his position, he may have been privy to some of the conversations about this man hadn't done it. He may have heard the trials, where he's aware at least of Paul to the degree that by the time they get to their first stop, he's allowing him some leeway.
Now, let me make you mentioned the time as far as the date, but notice like verse 7, the New King James says, when we had sailed slowly many days, I think yours says some days. Look at verse 9. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous, I don't know how much time is passing here, but weeks are passing in this, it would seem. And these are not comfortable quarters. This is a difficult, slow journey. And yet Luke's not really giving us any of the details about that. He's going to tell us about some of the really, really dangerous and difficult things later on. But just the mundane, difficult things that have been taking place, he just mentions in passing.
So no, you have some.
I just found it interesting what you had to say about the Mediterranean Sea and about what money is. If I understand what I've studied,
Yeah.
it would be another 1,400 years before ships could be built that could sail against the wind.
Mm-hmm.
So that would tell you one way that it would be dangerous to get out there, and why it would take them so long to get from place to place, because they would have to wait on the right wind before they could sail somewhere. I don't know what they did if they got out there and the wind changed.
Yeah, and they're staying at some of these port cities along the way, but I don't know that Paul's getting to go in and see the sights and things like that. We know that he was allowed liberty there, at least at Sidon, but I don't know that he wasn't stuck on the ship the whole time, and it would have been tough. It would have been very tough. All right, so when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end in disaster and much loss, not only of cargo and ship, but also of our lives." And so Paul's going to throw his 2 cents worth in here and say, I don't think we should go any further. It's too late in the year. It's too dangerous, and I think that it would be disastrous for the ship and for us. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than the things spoken by Paul. Does that make sense that he would be more persuaded by the helmsman? What's the helmsman's job? What's he an expert at?
Helmsing.
Helmsing, sailing. Yes, and the owner of the ship. Who has more at stake here than the owner of the ship? No one. And so, now what's Paul's expertise, area of expertise? He's a tent maker. Unless you want to say he's an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. Which if he's an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, and he can speak by inspiration, then you'd want to hang on every word, wouldn't you? But I don't think the centurion is overly convinced of that maybe at this point. And so, of course, he's going to be more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship. So they're going to ignore Paul. But it's interesting that Paul says this, that Paul makes this suggestion, because that's going to make his instruction or his suggestions later much more powerful.
So one reason you would not want to, he mentions that the harbor, this is verse 12, the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in. So it wasn't as nice of a harbor as there were, and ships needed to be protected from the elements, especially if they're carrying like a load of grain or something, because if the grain gets wet, it swells and spoils and it's ruined. And so what he's saying here, they want to just make it to another harbor that is better built so that they can keep the ship safe from the elements.
Remember the harbor at Caesarea?
Yes.
That had the wall, the protective wall around it? Something like that.
That's right.
That was a very nice harbor from what I understand for first century standards. So how far do they want to go?
Phoenix.
Just to Phoenix. It's right there. And so Paul says, I don't think we need to try to go any further. And the helmsman and the ship's owner say, well, we need to make it at least to Phoenix, where we have a nice port there. We can go that far. And so they're going to wait for the right conditions to be able to do so. And verse 13 says, when a south wind blew softly, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they put out to sea, sailing close by Crete. And so they're going to sail very close to the coast. Everything, we've got a nice, gentle, soft, southerly breeze blowing, and it's just going to take us right over to Phoenix. But not long afterward, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. Can you imagine what a disturbing situation this would be? We just need to go a little bit further to Phoenix. And you've got your sails, everything is fine, and all of a sudden, the sails blow back the other direction. What's the ship going to do? It's going to go the other direction. And it's like, we've got to keep going here. But you can't, and it's pushing you out, and it begins to push them out to sea at this point. And even if they lower the sails, they're still being pushed in the wrong direction. So what do? Everybody get out and stick their foot in the water and try to, paddle? Or there's nothing you can do. A very helpless situation here.
Yeah, so that word Euroclydon is a combination of two words. It's a Greek word that means eastern and a Latin word that means, northern and eastern, whatever the combination of words is. Anyway, but it's a northeaster. So sometimes you hear about those in the north, a nor'easter that blows in. That's what this is. And so it's a headwind blowing against them. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda. And you can see that there on the map. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. That would be its lifeboat on the side. And
Skiff, I think, is what the New King James says.
Yeah, and after hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. It's almost like girding the ship up, like tying around the ship. And then fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. So they're letting everything. They're just letting the wind carry them, because to resist it is going to break the ship apart. And so they're just doing whatever they can to keep adrift, pretty much.
All right, so you see Crete get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then you see this little island here, and then it disappears too. And look where they're at now. They're out where they can't see any land at all, and it's terribly rough on the sea. Now, I don't have any experience in rough seas. I mean, none at all. I've been on a lake before when there was, 5-10 mile an hour wind. That's about it. But
I've stirred up my bathwater.
Yeah. But I can't imagine in ancient sailing vessels the terror that must be of not being able to see land anywhere and being in a terrible storm on the sea. And that's where they're at. And they're just being driven. They're just being taken. They have zero control of what's taking place. So in verse 18, because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. How desperate do you have to be when you start throwing stuff overboard? Pretty desperate. And so what's the value of lightening the ship? Lightening the ship.
You're in real high seas, like 50, 60, 75 foot waves, and at times you're at the bottom, and at times you're at the top.
You want that.
If you got too much weight on your ship, even when the waves cross over your boat, if you were to take and lighten the load, your boat will rise
Yes.
up higher on the waves.
So that you want it to sit as high as possible in the water. And on the third day, now notice the time markers here. We have the next day, so it's been a full 24 hours now of being in this type of storm. Then on the third day, 3 days of that? Can you imagine? We threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. By the way, who's writing this? Luke. Luke just leaves it to the experts. Y'all are sailors, y'all do that. No, every hand on deck. Luke too is brought into the work, and they're throwing the ship's tackle over. In other words, at this point, this is we're just trying to survive. We've given up on making the trip and arriving with everything. We're just trying to survive at this point. 3 days this is taking place. But then look at verse 20. When neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we should be saved was finally given up. And so at this point, it's like, well, we're not even going to survive this. And so as Luke is writing this, really, Luke doesn't give us as many details as we can imagine. But you can, if these people have given up on life itself, you know how bad this is.
So, pretty desperate situation. What do we know, at least for Paul? He's going to make it to Rome, right? Now, we really don't know that about everybody else. But we do know that this ship, this crisis is not going to mean death for everybody, right? It's not going to mean that all hope should be abandoned. And actually, Paul, in verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me. I told you so. And not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss," which were the exact words that he said in verse 10. "We will be with injury and much loss." And so can you imagine that pilot and that captain, the owner of the ship now, and they're like, well, we didn't want to risk losing our grain, and now like they've had to throw stuff overboard, and now it looks like the ship might be destroyed and all of that. So anyway, he says, verse 22, "Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." What confidence to be able to say that in the middle of these circumstances. "For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on some island.'" So think about this. I am sure that these Roman sailors and centurions were wondering, why are the gods doing this to us? And Paul says, the God I serve, the one I worship, has said that we're going to lose the ship, but we're not going to lose the life. Now that might be somewhat of empty talk until it actually happens, right? But what he says is, I have faith in God. I trust that God is going to preserve us through this. And so there's not going to be any use in starving yourselves to death. So get some food. He takes some food after he gives, this is, what is this? Maybe I'm talking, no, I'm in the wrong place. 33 and 34 is when he takes some food. But anyway, but he's giving them the confidence to say, we're going to be preserved and we're going to run aground somewhere.
Telling somebody, I was right, you should have listened to me, is not that helpful unless there's some information that is going to be helpful to them. And he provides that. You should have listened to me before. You didn't. It's too late for that. But now I'm going to talk again, and if you listen to me now, it'll be beneficial. So the benefit of saying, I was right, you should have listened to me, is not just for Paul to say, I was right. Yeah. But the point is, listen to me now. And then he's going to tell them something that's good news. And you made a point. For Paul, we know that Paul's going to make it to Rome. Why do we know that Paul's going to make it to Rome? God said he was. Do you remember the story when the disciples were on a rough sea? Do you remember what Jesus had said to them before they got on the rough sea? Let us go over to the other side. And then in the middle, it looks like we're never going to make it to the other side. And Jesus said, "Oh, ye of little faith." And so here's Paul. And Paul's in the same situation. The Lord comes and reassures him. Remember my promise. You will make it. But notice the specificity of what he says. All right, you mentioned that there'll be no loss of life. Now, who there at this point felt like, we're all going to be fine? Nobody. How many people are on this ship? Verse 37.
276.
276 people. And everybody's going to be fine, Paul says. But we will lose the ship. Well, that's very hard to believe we're going to lose the ship and 276 people are going to be fine. I don't see how that could happen. All right? Notice how specific he was. And we're going to run upon a certain island. Now, maybe that would, you say, well, there's a good chance of that. We're going to hit, if we're going to survive, we're going to have to run on land somewhere. But he says, on a certain island. So there's some specific things there. And he says, God told me this, and I trust it, and I'm going to listen to it. And I want you to notice how this sets up things down the road for these people who are listening.
You would think that this would be comforting to hear from those people, for those people, because as far out as what they are, they probably had no idea where they were, where they were going to end up. So you would think the ship would be the last thing on their mind.
That's right.
I figure they were thinking they were probably going to die.
Yeah.
But how believable is it what Paul is saying? You talked about this would be comforting, but would you believe it?
Hope at all.
Yeah. For somebody to have some optimism would be helpful.
Yeah, you mentioned that they didn't know where they were. Verse 20, when neither sun nor star appeared for many days. That was how they got any bearings as to where they were, and they haven't seen any of that. So they really are kind of hopeless in one sense and lost. And then verse 27, when the 14th night had come. So even with that confidence, 2 weeks of just, kind of hopelessly adrift, we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea. About midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again, found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come, so they can be able to see in order to move closer. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat's ship into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. So notice this. God had promised that they would all be saved. And then here Paul says it's conditional. The men have to stay in the ship in order for everybody to be saved. So it wasn't as if this promise that God made was just, this is going to be fulfilled no matter what. It was, this is going to be fulfilled if they listen to Paul and do what he says. And in this case, it was they have to stay in the ship. And so now at this point, they're listening to Paul so confidently that they cut the ship away completely and let it go.
What if you are on a ship in a dangerous storm? What's the one thing that you want to hold on to? Food, all right? The lifeboat, the raft to get you to land, and that's the very thing that Paul says, cut it away. And what I see here is an incredible act of faith on the centurion's part to say, all right, if this prisoner says to cut the lifeboat away, then cut it away. Now, what were the sailors? Luke words it in such a way we have to kind of fill in some of the details. What were the sailors doing with the lifeboat? I think that's exactly right. What they saw is, hey, you know what? We can't all fit on this lifeboat. But the 4 or 6 or however many of us can. And so why don't we get in the lifeboat, pretend that we're putting out anchors, and then we'll head to shore. And at least we can be saved. I think that was probably what was taking place here. And Paul says, nope, cut it away. And so the soldiers do so. They cut it away.
So you got different groups here. You have sailors and soldiers.
Yeah.
And the soldiers are the ones who cut it away.
Yes.
And the sailors are probably like, well, that's a bummer.
So the other thing that
They did not like Paul.
take parts that you before you get the land.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what. You know how they're going to end up getting the land? By swimming or holding on to pieces of the ship. And so a skiff or a life raft would seem pretty good in that circumstance. But it's not there. All right, so notice that verse 33. As the day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing." Why in the world would you go 14 days without eating?
I think if they throw everything overboard, it ain't, probably ain't that much food there on the boat to eat.
All right, I think that's right. First of all, I can imagine it'd be difficult to eat in the middle of a storm. But I think probably the fear is food has not been of the utmost importance at this point. And Paul says at this point, urge you, take nourishment, verse 34. For this is your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head, the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all there were about 276 persons on the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. Don made the point, he said, what would you want to hold on to? You don't want to hold on to the food. And they had held on to the food. They'd already lightened the ship of everything else non-essential. They had held on to the food. At this point, though, they eat and they throw the rest of it over because this is an all or nothing now. They are committed. If they can make it to land, then they've got to make it to land. And so you see that. So think about the situation here. That was not the photo that I meant to have up there. Oh, no. I've gone all the way back to the beginning. Paul, when Paul is speaking to them, and he says, my God has told me this, and I believe it'll happen. And then he says, take courage and eat. And he assures them again, not a hair of your head will fall. And so they are believing Paul at this point. And then notice what Paul does. He took bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when they had broken it, they began to eat. Can you see the progression of Paul pointing them to his God? That's the one I'm looking for. Thank you. All right, I'll stop right there and put this down. But what effect do you think that would have? Here you are, one of the sailors, one of the soldiers, one of the other prisoners, a passenger or whatever. And then here's this prisoner, and you observe his conduct, his mannerisms, his speech. You hear his advice, it's ignored. You see that comes to pass precisely. And then he speaks other words. And obviously you see the centurion's confidence in him at this point. But what's he pointing to? My God has told me this. I thank my God for this food that we have at this point. And you see people noticing this in the presence of them all. And they took courage and eat at this. And so you see the influence that Paul has as this trip continues, as his confidence in their eyes is being built.
You see him doing exactly what God called him to do.
That's right. That's exactly right. Any thoughts, comments?
All right, so as we go to verse 39, now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So what's happening is they're stuck and the waves are beating against it and it's just breaking the ship apart. And then, of course, the soldiers, the reason they want to kill the prisoners is because if these prisoners do escape, they get onto this island, they don't know what this land is, they don't know how big it is. If they get on the island and run away, then the soldiers are held accountable for that and they will pay with their lives. And so they just say, well, it's better to kill them first and then we'll make our way to the land. But Julius, and think about the other prisoners are being saved because of Julius's concern for Paul. And so he protects him. And obviously all of this is orchestrated by the providence of God.
And by the way, now we see Julius trusting Paul to such a degree that he puts his own life at risk and the life of his men at risk in order to save Paul. And so you see that progressing quite a bit.
The end of verse 44, and so it was that they were all brought safely to land. You know, as they look around and they start counting, and they get to 276, and they're like, whoa, you know, not one of them eaten by a shark. You know, like everybody makes it to the beach. That's a pretty powerful testimony to the truth of what Paul was saying, that an angel of God, the God he worships, the God he serves, the God he had given thanks to, the God that had made these promises to him, that he was faithful. And, you know, Neptune or, you know, whoever is the God of the sea, he's not in charge. The God Paul worships is in charge. He rules the seas. And they needed to recognize that.
You know, there are a number of places where Luke doesn't tell us how many people became Christians. But I would really like to know, surely out of these 276 people, there were those that became Christians. Did Julius become a Christian? You know, I mean, we're not told. But
It would take a hard heart.
yeah, that's exactly right.
Especially with the confidence that he's already gaining in Paul as we go along.
You can deliver people from big fish.
So maybe he thought everybody would die, Paul would get scooped up by a shark, and then
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, that's right.
Good observation.
So Luke, usually when he writes he's with them, and then he's not with them. Is this just for storytelling effect or something that he's?
No, I think he's with them.
Oh, I know he's with them.
Oh.
But he says they like almost exclusively through the whole ship thing. Like he says we sometimes.
Oh, well, yeah, so I think he's making a distinction between him and Paul and Aristarchus, prisoners, sailors, soldiers. There's different groups, and like they're not operating as one. So like sometimes they have different intentions, right? The sailors have one intention, the soldiers have a different intention. So I think it's probably just in whatever the immediate context is. Yeah, and maybe him included as part of the whole ship, you know, part of the whole crew. But there are times where he does refer to they. So like verse 39, when it says, they did not recognize the land. Well, I assume he's talking about the sailors, the people who would be experts at what's going on here. I don't think he's distancing himself from the ship. I think he's distancing himself from the sailors who know what they're doing out there.
Well, we probably
Yeah.
need to stop there because we don't have time to go much further. So, Lord willing, we will finish up chapter 28 next time. And you may want to go ahead and start reading Ephesians because that'll be the next, after we finish Acts, we will go into Ephesians. And so you may want to go ahead and start reading those 6 chapters and read it as many times as you can as before and as we talk about it. And that'll help us to get a better grasp of it. Appreciate the good comments tonight. Appreciate the good attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.